The Galactic Council chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of alien species when the human vessel appeared on the main viewing screen, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence that quickly turned into poorly hidden laughter. And Ambassador Zixthor of the Calithian Empire could not contain his amusement as he pointed one of his forearms at the image on the screen, and his translator crackled with his mocking tone as he spoke to the assembled diplomats around him, and asked if this corroded heap of salvaged metal was truly what humanity had sent to represent their species in front of the entire galactic community, and the other aliens joined in the laughter, because the ship looked nothing like the sleek warships and elegant diplomatic cruisers that filled the orbital docks around the council station, and the human vessel called the Liberty Runner, appeared to be a patchwork of mismatched panels, with some clearly welded over old breach points and rust stains streaked across its surface like old battle scars that told stories of decades of hard use, and the engines were visible through gaps in the outer plating, and seemed to be held together with what the aliens assumed was primitive adhesive material in desperate hope rather than proper engineering. Captain Jake Murphy stood on the bridge of the Liberty Runner, and he was fully aware of how his ship appeared to the gathered alien races, because his crew of 12 had grown used to the stares and the whispered comments that followed them at every port they visited, and his first officer, Lisa Grant, stood beside him with her sharp eyes focused on her datapad as she reviewed the docking protocols, and she spoke without looking up and said they were laughing at them again. And Jake replied in a calm voice that they should let them laugh because the registry office had already approved their credentials, and they were here on legitimate business, and nothing else mattered. Beyond that simple fact, the Liberty Runner had begun her life 70 years ago as a mining freighter that hauled ore from the asteroid belts of the outer colonies, and she had changed hands a dozen times over the decades and survived 3 different wars and been rebuilt so many times that only 15% of her original components remained in her current configuration. But she still flew, and more importantly, she was paid for with no corporate loans and no government strings attached. And it was just a ship and a crew trying to make an honest living on the frontier, where honest work was hard to find, and Jake Murphy valued that freedom above everything else, including the opinions of smug alien diplomats who had never worked a day in their pampered lives down in the engine room. Chief Engineer Paul Dixon wiped grease from his hands and listened to the familiar hum of the reactor core, and the sound was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat after 8 years of service on the Liberty Runner, and he knew every bolt and every wire and every improvised repair that kept her running when she had no right to still be functional, and his assistant Kevin Torres, who had joined the crew only 6 months ago, asked how she was holding up, and Paul said she would hold just fine, but they needed to keep an eye on the port side stabilizer, because it had been running a bit hot since they jumped into this system, and Kevin nodded and made a note on his datapad. The docking procedure took much longer than necessary, because the automated systems of the council station kept trying to categorize the Liberty Runner and failing to find a match in their database, and her design did not match any known classification that the galactic community recognized, and eventually, a frustrated dockmaster had to manually assign them a berth in the outer ring, far from the prestigious inner docks, where the council members kept their expensive vessels, and this suited Jake just fine because he preferred to avoid unnecessary attention anyway. Jake and Lisa made their way through the station corridors toward the council chamber, and they passed groups of aliens from dozens of different species, and the reactions were almost universal as curious glances turned to barely concealed amusement when the aliens realized these humans had arrived on that pitiful vessel in Dock 47, and the Velicans with their crystalline exoskeletons chittered among themselves in harmonic tones that their translators rendered as mocking commentary, and the massive Grothnar, who each stood nearly 3 meters tall, simply stared with their compound eyes, and even the normally reserved Asterians, whose species prided themselves on diplomatic courtesy, struggled to maintain neutral expressions as the humans walked past. One Asterian diplomat ventured a comment as they waited in the antechamber and said that their vessel was quite unique, and Jake replied simply that she got them where they needed to go, and the diplomat said he was certain she did, though his tone suggested he found that fact difficult to believe, and Jake did not bother to correct the aliens' assumptions, because there was no point in arguing with someone who had already made up their mind. The council meeting itself was brief and unremarkable, as Jake was there to register a mining claim his crew had discovered in an uncharted system, and it was a standard procedure that required his physical presence due to some arcane galactic regulation that nobody could properly explain. And the council members barely paid attention to his presentation because they clearly considered the matter beneath their notice. And it was just one human captain, with one unremarkable claim in one insignificant system, and they approved it with a quick vote and dismissed him without ceremony. It was after the meeting in the station's trading quarter that everything changed, and Jake and Lisa were reviewing supply prices at a merchant's stall when the alarm began to sound. And it was not the gentle chime of a routine announcement, but the harsh, urgent wail of a station-wide emergency, and every screen in the trading quarter suddenly displayed the same message in a dozen different languages, and the message said that long-range sensors had detected a Krell raiding fleet approaching the system, and estimated time to arrival was 4 hours, and all civilian ships were advised to evacuate immediately, and all military vessels were ordered to report to the defense coordinator. The Krell were the scourge of this sector, and they were a predatory species that survived by raiding other civilizations, and they took technology and resources and slaves, and left nothing but empty stations and dead worlds in their wake. And panic spread through the trading quarter like wildfire, as aliens of every species rushed toward the docks, and they were desperate to reach their ships before the Krell arrived. And Jake and Lisa fought against the tide of bodies as they made their way back to the Liberty Runner, as quickly as the crowd would allow. When they reached the docking bay, they found most of their crew already performing pre-flight checks, and Paul had the engines warming up, and the low rumble filled the bay and seemed to irritate the nearby Calithian diplomatic vessel. And Carl Hayes, the navigator, announced that the captain was on deck as Jake climbed through the airlock, and Jake asked what their status was. And Lisa reported that engines were ready and cargo was secured and all systems were showing green, and they could launch in 10 minutes. Through the view screen, they could see other ships undocking in various states of readiness, and the sleek Calithian cruiser slid out of its berth with practiced grace, and its hull gleamed under the station lights, and an Asterian diplomatic ship followed with its elegant curves, a stark contrast to the Liberty Runner's angular patched exterior, and Jake ordered Carl to plot a course out of the system and to stay clear of the mass traffic, because the last thing they needed was a collision in this mess, as the Liberty Runner detached from the station and began maneuvering toward open space. Jake noticed something on the tactical display, and the defense coordinator was organizing the handful of military vessels present into a defensive formation, and they were hoping to buy time for the civilian evacuation. But the numbers looked bad, with only 3 outdated patrol frigates and a few private security craft against a Krell raiding fleet, and Amy Sullivan, the communications officer, reported that they were receiving a general broadcast from the defense coordinator, and Jake told her to put it through. A Grothnar officer appeared on the screen with his mandibles clicking with stress, and he said that the Krell fleet was larger than initially estimated, with 16 warships including at least 2 heavy cruisers, and civilian evacuation was proceeding too slowly, and he needed any ship capable of combat to volunteer for the defensive line, and he repeated that he needed volunteers, and the bridge fell silent, because every member of the crew knew what that meant, and the Liberty Runner had some defensive weapons like standard anti-piracy measures that most independent freighters carried. But against a Krell fleet, they would be as useful as throwing rocks at a battleship. Lisa asked quietly what Jake wanted to do, and Jake stared at the tactical display and watched the Krell fleet's projected approach vector. And then he looked at the evacuation progress indicator, and dozens of civilian ships were still docked, and their slow departure procedures would be a death sentence if the Krell arrived before they could escape. And Jake said to belay the jump calculation, and ordered the helm to bring them about, and told Amy to inform the defense coordinator that the Liberty Runner was volunteering for the defensive line. The tactical display painted a grim picture, as 16 red contacts representing the Krell raiding fleet advanced steadily toward the station, and their formation was tight and professional, and against them stood only 4 patrol frigates, and the Liberty Runner and 3 private security vessels whose captains had been brave or foolish enough to volunteer. And Captain Jake Murphy studied the enemy formation from his command chair, and his experienced eyes picked out details that the tactical computer could not quantify. And the Krell were overconfident as they maintained their approach speed without any attempt at tactical maneuvering, because they had done this 100 times before. and they expected this time to be no different. From all their previous raids, Lisa reported from her station that Defense Coordinator Thulmar was organizing the defensive positions, and he wanted them on the left flank with 2 of the security ships. And Jake nodded, because the left flank was the weakest position, and it was the one most likely to collapse under concentrated fire, and the coordinator was putting the least valuable ships where they could do the least damage when they inevitably died, and it was cold military logic, and Jake could not fault the Grothnar for making that calculation. Jake acknowledged the order and told the helm to take them to position, and the Liberty Runner moved into formation, and her engines burned steadily, despite their worn appearance, and through the view screen Jake could see the patrol frigates taking up their positions, and they were Asterian-built vessels that were sleek and efficient, but they were 20 years old and had been relegated to backwater patrol duty for a reason, and Jake suspected they would not last long in a real fight. Carl Hayes spoke up from the navigation station and said he was picking up something odd, and his brow furrowed as he studied his displays, and he said the patrol frigates were coordinating their jump drives. And Lisa looked up sharply and asked why they would be coordinating jump drives in the middle of a defensive formation. And Jake said quietly that they were planning to run, and the realization settled over the bridge like a cold wait. And he explained that as soon as the shooting started, the frigates were going to jump out and leave the civilians to fend for themselves. It made a certain kind of sense because the frigates were military vessels with crews and families waiting for them back home, and why should they die for a random merchant station in some backwater system? But it also meant that the defensive line would collapse the moment the Krell opened fire, and Amy asked what they were going to do, and Jake was quiet for a long moment as his fingers drummed on the armrest of his chair, and then he leaned forward and activated the ship-wide intercom. He announced to all hands that he was not going to sugarcoat the situation, and the military ships were planning to abandon them as soon as the fight started. And that meant it was going to be the Liberty Runner and maybe a few security ships against the entire Krell fleet, and he gave everyone 5 minutes to decide, and anyone who wanted to take an escape pod and get clear had his blessing with no questions and no judgment, but anyone who stayed did so, knowing what they were up against, and he released the intercom button and waited. The bridge crew remained at their stations, and nobody moved toward the exits, and after 3 minutes, Paul Dixon's voice crackled over the engineering channel, and he reported that all personnel in engineering were present and accounted for, and nobody was running, and similar reports came in from each section of the ship as 12 crew members made 12 decisions to stay. Jake said that they should make this count, and told Paul he needed everything he could give him from those engines, and Paul said he would have it, and Jake told Amy to open a channel to the defense coordinator, and the Grothnar officer appeared on the screen with his compound eyes reflecting the red glow of emergency lighting, and he ordered the Liberty Runner to maintain position. Jake said the coordinator needed to listen carefully and explained that when the Krell fleet reached firing range, the frigates were going to jump away, and the coordinator knew it, and Jake knew it, and probably the Krell knew it too, and Thulmar's mandibles clicked in what might have been anger or resignation, and he said he had no authority over those vessels because their captains answered to their own governments. Jake said he understood, but he had a proposal, and when the frigates ran, the coordinator should tell the remaining civilian ships to make for the far side of the station away from the Krell approach vector, and the Liberty Runner would buy them as much time as they could, and the coordinator asked how they could possibly do that when their vessel was unarmed compared to a Krell warship, and Jake asked if the coordinator had ever seen a wounded animal. Run Thulmar's expression was hard to read, but his tone carried understanding as he said that Jake planned to flee, and Jake said he planned to make the Krell chase them away from the station and away from the civilians, and they might not be much in a fight, but this old rust bucket could run like hell when she needed to. And there was a pause as the coordinator processed this, and then he said that the Krell would destroy them. Jake replied that maybe they would, but every minute the Krell spent chasing them was another minute for those civilians to escape, and it was the best chance anyone had. And there was another pause that was longer this time, and when Thulmar spoke again, his voice carried a note of respect that had not been there before, and he said that Jake's sacrifice would be remembered, and Jake said he hoped it would not come to that, and ended the communication. The Krell fleet closed to weapons range 90 minutes later, and on the tactical display the red contacts spread out slightly as they prepared to envelop the defensive position, and Jake watched the patrol frigates on his sensors and waited for the inevitable. And Carl announced that the Krell fleet was opening fire. The first salvo lit up the darkness with energy beams and plasma bursts, and the patrol frigates returned fire, and their weapons tracked across the void, and for 15 seconds, it looked like an actual battle. And then simultaneously all 4 frigates activated their jump drives and space twisted around them as they vanished, and they left the Liberty Runner and the 3 security ships alone against 16 Krell warships. Lisa breathed that those miserable cowards had actually done it, and Jake snapped at her to focus and ordered the helm to make a full burn away from the station, and he wanted them loud and obvious, and he told Amy to broadcast on all Krell frequencies and tell them they were carrying valuable cargo and running scared. And Amy asked if he was sure, and Jake said to do it and make them think they were a prize worth chasing. The Liberty Runner's engines flared to full power and the old freighter began to accelerate, and behind them the security ships hesitated for only a moment before following suit, and they broke formation and scattered in different directions. And on the lead, Krell warship, the commander watched the human vessel flee and let out a sound that was almost like laughter, and the translator rendered it as a statement that the humans were running, and he ordered his ships to hunt them down. 5 Krell ships broke off from the main fleet to pursue the Liberty Runner, and the remaining 11 continued toward the station. But their attention was divided now because some of their force had been pulled away, chasing what looked like an easy target, and Carl reported that Krell pursuers were adjusting course, and 5 ships were closing fast, and Jake asked how fast they were, and Carl said they would be in firing range in 40 minutes at their current speed. Jake asked how long until they would be clear of the station's gravity well, and Carl said 20 minutes, and Jake said that was perfect and asked Paul about their jump drive status, and Paul's voice came back immediately and said it was charged and ready, but he would not recommend using it until they were well clear, because the interference from the station could cause unpredictable results, and Jake nodded to himself because everything depended on timing. Now, the Liberty Runner raced away from the station with her engines burning at maximum output, and behind them, the Krell ships gave chase, and their superior speed brought them steadily closer. And on the station, coordinator Thulmar watched the human ship draw away the pursuit and immediately began directing the remaining civilian vessels to evacuate from the opposite side, and the Krell were still approaching, but their attention was split now, and it was the opening he needed. Aboard the Liberty Runner, the crew worked with practiced efficiency, and Kevin Torres monitored every fluctuation in the engine output and made micro-adjustments to keep the burn steady, and Amy kept broadcasting false distress signals to make the ship sound like a panicking merchant vessel, and Lisa coordinated the defensive systems as she prepared for the inevitable moment when the Krell got close enough to fire. Carl announced 20 minutes to jump capability, and Lisa added that Krell ships were entering maximum weapons range, and they were firing. And the first energy beams lanced through space and missed the Liberty Runner by several hundred meters because the Krell were firing at extreme range and testing their targeting systems. And the next salvo would be closer. Jake ordered evasive maneuvers in random pattern delta, and the Liberty Runner began to juke and weave, and her movements were unpredictable. And the old freighter was not built for combat maneuvering, but she could change her vector enough to make herself a harder target, and more weapons fire streaked past them, and one beam. The Liberty Runner emerged from jump space 3 light-years away from the station, and her hull was scarred and smoking but intact, and on the bridge the crew let out a collective breath they had not realized they were holding, and Carl reported, "That jump was complete and they were clear," and his voice was shaky but relieved. Jake allowed himself to slump back in his chair as the adrenaline slowly drained from his system, and around him the bridge crew began checking their systems and assessing the damage, and it was extensive, but they were alive. And Lisa consulted her displays, and her expression was grim as she delivered the damage report. She said they had hull breaches on decks 2 and 3 that were sealed by emergency bulkheads, and the port shield generator was completely fried, and they had burns across multiple sections of plating. And life support was functioning but strained, and they were venting atmosphere from at least 6 different points. And Jake asked how long they could maintain life support, and Lisa said 48 hours at most, and maybe less if they could not seal those leaks. Jake nodded slowly because they had survived the chase, but they were not out of danger yet, and he told Amy to try to raise the station and let them know they made it. and Amy said she was on it and down in engineering. Paul Dixon was already coordinating repair efforts, and Kevin Torres and the other mechanics moved through the damaged sections with welding equipment and patch materials, and they worked to seal breaches and reroute systems around damaged components. The Liberty Runner might look like a rust bucket, but her crew knew every centimeter of her, and they knew how to keep her running, even when she had no right to still be functional. And Amy announced that she had the station and they were requesting visual communication, and Jake told her to put them through. Coordinator Thulmar appeared on the screen, and for the first time since Jake had met him, the Grothnar looked genuinely surprised, and he said that they had expected the Liberty Runner to be destroyed, and Jake replied that they were harder to kill than they looked, and asked what the situation was at the station. Thulmar said that all civilian vessels had successfully evacuated and the Krell fleet had pursued them initially. But when the Liberty Runner jumped away, they turned their attention to Jake's ship instead, and Jake had drawn off 5 of their ships, which allowed the coordinator to organize a more effective evacuation, and the remaining Krell vessels eventually gave up the chase and left the system. And Thulmar paused before continuing and said that Jake's actions had saved hundreds of lives. Jake felt the weight of those words settle on him and said they just did what anyone would do. But Thulmar said firmly that Jake was wrong, because the military vessels had fled and the other civilian ships had scattered. But Jake had turned back and then made himself a target to draw the enemy away, and that was not what anyone would do before Jake could respond. Another voice interrupted the communication, and it was Ambassador Zixthor of the Calithian Empire, and the screen split to show both the coordinator and the Calithian ambassador, and Zixthor's expression was difficult to read, but his tone had none of the condescension it had carried earlier. He said that he had witnessed Jake's actions, and he must confess that he had underestimated both Jake and his vessel, and on behalf of the Calithian Empire, he offered his formal apology for his earlier discourtesy. And Jake blinked in surprise, because an apology from a Calithian ambassador was virtually unheard of, and their species was notorious for their pride. Jake said that the apology was accepted, though he was not sure what they had done that was so surprising, because they just ran away, and Zixthor said that Jake had run in such a way that made him appear vulnerable while maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of pursuit, and he had timed his jump to within seconds of destruction, and that was not cowardice, but tactical brilliance. Jake said that was generous, but they were mostly just trying not to die. And a new voice interrupted, as an Asterian officer spoke up, and her crystalline features were sharp and precise, and she identified herself as Fleet Admiral Kistara of the Asterian Defense Force, and she said she was reading considerable damage to the human vessel, and asked if they required assistance. Thulmar looked to Jake and asked if the captain needed help, and Jake said they could manage their own repairs, but thanked the admiral for the offer, and Kistara said nonsense, because Jake had risked his vessel for civilians that included her people, and the least they could do was provide repair materials and technical support, and she was dispatching a supply ship to their location immediately. The communication ended before Jake could protest further, and he looked at Lisa, who shrugged and said it seemed they were getting help whether they wanted it or not. And over the next 6 hours, the Liberty Runner became a hub of unexpected activity, and the Asterian supply ship arrived first with its holds, filled with hull plating and replacement components, and a team of engineers who looked at the human ship with a mixture of professional curiosity and growing respect. The lead Asterian engineer was a woman named Tavin, and she walked through the Liberty Runner's corridors with Paul Dixon, and her expression was thoughtful as she examined the repairs and modifications, and she said finally that their repair work was crude but effective, and they had managed to keep systems functioning that should have failed years ago. Paul replied that they made do with what they had, and he was unsure if he was being complimented or criticized, and Tywin said he should not misunderstand her, because this was a compliment, and her people built ships to exact specifications, and when they failed they replaced them. But humans adapted and improvised and took something that should be dead and made it live. She ran her hand along a bulkhead where 3 different types of metal had been welded together, and asked how long this vessel had been in service, and Paul said 70 years, give or take, and Taven made a sound that might have been laughter and said their vessels were rated for 50 years before mandatory retirement. Yet the Liberty Runner had surpassed that by 2 decades, and they had flown it into combat. She looked at Paul with what seemed like genuine admiration and said they were either mad or brilliant, and perhaps both. And as the repairs progressed, more ships began arriving, and a Velikan merchant vessel delivered food supplies and medical equipment and refused payment, and a Grothnar transport brought replacement parts that the Liberty Runner technically was not supposed to have access to, and even a small Calithian shuttle appeared, and its pilot delivered a sealed message for Captain Jake Murphy. Jake read the message in private, and it was from Ambassador Zixthor, written in formal High Calithian that had been translated into English, and the ambassador said he had been a member of the galactic community for 40 standard years, and in that time he had witnessed countless acts of courage and countless acts of cowardice. But what Jake had done was something different. He had understood that his vessel was inadequate for combat, and that his chances of survival were minimal, and yet he acted anyway because it was necessary. And this was a quality the Calithian people valued highly, and when repairs were complete, Zixthor would consider it an honor if Jake would accept an invitation to visit the Calithian homeworld as his personal guest. Jake set the message aside and was not sure how to feel about the sudden attention, because he had simply done what needed to be done, and the fact that it had impressed the aliens so much said more about their expectations than about his actions. And on the bridge, Lisa was coordinating with the various supply ships when a priority message came through, and she frowned at the screen and then called Jake back to the command deck. She said that he needed to see this, and the message was from the Asterian Defense Force marked urgent and classified, and Jake opened it to find Fleet Admiral Kistara's face on the screen, and she said that their analysis of the engagement had revealed something unusual. The Krell ships that pursued the Liberty Runner were among their fastest vessels, and equipped with engines that should have overtaken Jake's ship within 20 minutes, yet he had maintained his distance for 40 minutes before jumping to safety, and the coordinator initially assumed this was due to evasive maneuvering, but their tactical computers had run the calculations. The Admiral said that Jake's evasion patterns, while effective, should not have extended the chase by more than 5 minutes at most, and she paused before asking directly how fast his ship was, and Jake and Lisa exchanged glances because it was a question they had been asked before by port authorities, and curious merchants. Jake said carefully that they had never really pushed her to find out, and Kistara said she would very much like to know the answer to that question, and when repairs were complete, would Jake be willing to conduct a speed trial, and they would provide a controlled environment and compensate him for his time. Jake thought about it because the Liberty Runner's speed had always been their secret advantage, and the reason they could take contracts that other ships could not match, but the cat was already halfway out of the bag, and the aliens had noticed something unusual, and he said they would consider it and would let the Admiral know after discussing it with his crew. After the message ended, Lisa turned to him and asked if they were really going to tell them how fast they could go, and Jake said maybe, or maybe they would show them something even more interesting, and he activated the ship-wide intercom, and the racing course was established in an empty system 2 jumps away from the merchant station, and Fleet Admiral Kistara had assembled an impressive array of vessels to observe the trial, and there were 3 Asterian military corvettes and 2 Calithian fast attack cruisers and a Velikan observation ship, and even a Grothnar heavy monitor that had been in the area on patrol duty. The Liberty Runner sat at the starting line, and her patched hull looked even more worn in comparison to the sleek military vessels around her, and repairs had been completed with help from the Asterian engineers, though Paul had politely declined their offers to upgrade the engine systems, because some secrets were worth keeping. Lisa observed from her station that this was quite the audience as she watched the tactical display fill with observer ships, and Jake replied that he could not blame them, because they wanted to understand how the Liberty Runner had survived, and speed was the answer, but they needed to see it to believe it. On the Asterian flagship, Admiral Kistara reviewed the course parameters with her tactical staff, and the race would cover 200,000 kilometers through a series of marked waypoints, and the Liberty Runner would run against 3 Asterian corvettes, and the corvettes were fast military-grade vessels designed for pursuit and interception, and on paper they should easily outpace a 70-year-old freighter. Her communications officer reported that the human captain was requesting direct communication, and Kistara gestured for the channel to be opened, and Captain Jake Murphy appeared on her screen, looking relaxed despite the situation, and he said that his crew had been discussing the speed trial and they appreciated the scientific approach, but they would like to make this more interesting. Kaistara asked how exactly they wanted to make it more interesting, and Jake said that instead of just running the course, they would like to propose a wager, and if the Asterian corvettes could beat the Liberty Runner, then Jake would provide complete access to their engine specifications, and every modification, and every adjustment, and everything they had done over the years. Kaistara's crystalline features shifted in what might have been surprise, and she said that was a generous offer, and asked what would happen if Jake won, and he said that the Asterian Defense Force would provide them with a letter of commendation and something they could show to port authorities when they got nervous about the ship's appearance. Kaistara said a letter of commendation, and she considered this because it was a trivial request compared to what they were offering, and she said that Jake realized her corvettes were among the fastest ships in the sector, and Jake said he was counting on it because otherwise it would not be much of a race. There was something in the human's tone and a confidence that went beyond bravado, and Kaistara had reviewed the tactical data from the Krell engagement multiple times, and the numbers did not quite add up because the Liberty Runner should have been caught and destroyed, yet somehow it had stayed ahead of pursuit for far longer than should have been possible. She said very well, and they accepted his terms and told him to prepare for race start in 10 minutes, and as the communication ended, Kaistara turned to her tactical officer and said she wanted full sensor logs on the Liberty Runner's performance and every measurement and every reading, because if these humans had discovered something new about drive efficiency, she wanted to know what it was aboard the Liberty Runner. Jake surveyed his bridge crew, and they had all volunteered to stay for this race despite having no obligation to do so, and the ship was repaired, and they could have simply gone their separate ways and returned to normal cargo runs. But they had chosen to be here. Jake asked Paul over the intercom how the engines were, and Paul replied that they were running smooth as silk and he had the safety limiters ready to disengage on Jake's command. And Jake asked Carl if he had the course plotted, and Carl said yes, and optimal path loaded and ready. And Jake asked Lisa about the status of all systems, and Lisa said green across the board with shields at full and weapons safed and all crew at stations. Jake nodded slowly and said they should show them what this rust bucket could really do, and the countdown began, and the 3 Asterian corvettes took up positions alongside the Liberty Runner, and their hulls gleamed with military precision, and each one was half the size of the human freighter, but packed with advanced propulsion systems and streamlined designs that minimized drag in real space. Admiral Kaistara's voice echoed across the communication channels and told all vessels to prepare for race start, and she counted down from 3 to 2 to 1 and said, "Begin." 4 ships leaped forward simultaneously, and the corvettes accelerated smoothly, and their engines fired with practiced efficiency, and the Liberty Runner's engines roared to life with a sound that was decidedly less refined and more of a barely controlled explosion than a precision burn. For the first 30 seconds, the race looked exactly as expected, and the corvettes pulled ahead steadily, and their superior acceleration gave them an early lead, and the observers watched with mild interest as they were already preparing post-race reports that would politely explain what everyone had known from the start, and that military vessels were faster than civilian freighters. Then Paul Dixon disengaged the safety limiters, and the Liberty Runner's engines surged with power that should not have been possible, and the old fusion cores that had been modified and pushed far beyond their original specifications poured energy into the drive system with reckless efficiency, and the ship lurched forward like a startled animal, and her acceleration curve suddenly matched and then exceeded the military corvettes. On the Asterian flagship, alarms began to sound, and the tactical officer reported with disbelief in his voice that the Liberty Runner's power output just tripled, and he asked how that was possible. And Kaistara stared at her displays as the human freighter began to close the gap with her corvettes, and she said she did not know, but to keep recording everything. Inside the Liberty Runner, the crew held on as their ship shook and rattled with the force of maximum acceleration. And Kevin Torres watched his engineering displays with wide eyes as power readings climbed into the red zone and kept climbing. And he asked Paul if they were supposed to be running this hot. And Paul replied cheerfully that nope, they were not, but she was holding together so they would keep going. On the bridge, Carl called out waypoint markers as they passed them, and the Liberty Runner was now running neck and neck with the corvettes, and her battered hull somehow kept pace with vessels that cost 100 times more to build. And Lisa reported that the corvettes were increasing speed, and Jake ordered them to match the increase and told Paul to give him everything he had, and Paul said he was giving 140%. The Liberty Runner pulled ahead of 2 of the corvettes, and the third piloted by an Asterian commander named Velthar, who refused to be beaten by a human freighter, pushed his own engines to maximum output, and the 2 ships raced side by side through the void, and neither gave ground. Carl announced that course correction was coming in 30 seconds, and it was a sharp turn around marker 4, and this was the moment that would determine the race because the waypoint markers required precise maneuvering at high speed. And military vessels were designed for this, with advanced stabilizers and maneuvering thrusters that could adjust their trajectory without significant speed loss, and a freighter like the Liberty Runner would normally have to slow down significantly to make such turns. Jake said to prepare for the turn and told Lisa to transfer all available power to the starboard thrusters, and Lisa said she was transferring now in 20 seconds to the turn, and the corvette alongside them began its deceleration burn as it bled off speed to maintain control through the corner. But the Liberty Runner did not slow down. 10 seconds, and Carl said with tension in his voice that they were going too fast, and Jake said he knew and told him to hold course. And 5 seconds, and the Liberty Runner hit the waypoint marker at full speed and threw herself into a turn that should have torn her apart starboard. Thrusters fired at maximum output and fought against momentum and inertia, and the crew was thrown against their restraints as G-forces spiked and metal groaned in protest. But the old ship held together because years of improvised repairs and layers of patches and welds somehow managed to keep the hull intact under stress that would have defeated a lesser vessel. The Liberty Runner came out of the turn with her speed barely diminished while the corvette was still completing its controlled deceleration. And Lisa breathed that they just pulled that off, and Jake said not to celebrate yet, because there were 2 more turns to go. The second turn went the same way, and the Liberty Runner pushed through at speeds that defied safety regulations and common sense, and her crew hung on and trusted in Paul's modifications and the ship's stubborn refusal to break, and the corvettes forced to follow proper procedure fell further behind. By the third turn, the other 2 corvettes had given up trying to match the human ship's reckless pace, and only Velthar remained in pursuit, and even he was now nearly a full kilometer behind. Carl announced the final stretch, and it was a straight run to the finish line, covering 100,000 kilometers. And Jake asked Paul if they had anything left, and there was a pause on the engineering channel. And then Paul said one more trick, but it was going to cost them. Over the following weeks, the Liberty Runner became something of a celebrity in the sector, and news of the race spread quickly through the merchant networks and military channels, and the rust bucket that everyone had mocked had outrun military corvettes and proven that appearances could be deceiving. Ambassador Zixthor made good on his invitation and hosted Jake and several crew members on the Calithian homeworld, and the visit was surprisingly pleasant, with the ambassador going out of his way to introduce the humans to other members of the galactic community, and the condescension that had marked their first meeting was gone and replaced by genuine respect. During a private dinner, Zixthor said that Jake had changed how many species viewed humanity, because before they were seen as newcomers and barely worth noticing, but now they were seen as resourceful and brave and surprisingly capable, and Jake replied that they were just trying to make a living. And Zixthor said, yes, but they did so in a way that commanded attention. He said that the story of Jake's defense of the merchant station had spread widely, and so too had the story of the race against the Asterian corvettes, and Jake had become, whether he intended it or not, a symbol of human potential. And Jake shifted uncomfortably and said he was not sure he was comfortable being a symbol, and Zixthor said then he should be an example instead, and show other humans that it was possible to succeed among the galactic community, even with limited resources and despite initial disadvantages. Back at the Asterian shipyards, the Liberty Runner underwent extensive repairs and modifications, and true to her word, Admiral Kistara provided unlimited access to yard facilities and technical support, and Paul Dixon worked closely with Asterian engineers and shared insights about his modifications while learning new techniques from their advanced technical knowledge. The collaboration was fascinating for both sides, and the Asterian engineers were amazed by the humans' willingness to push systems beyond their safe limits and accept calculated risks in exchange for improved performance, and Paul meanwhile learned about refinements and efficiency, improvements that could make his modifications more reliable and sustainable. One day Tyven observed as they reviewed power flow diagrams that humans approached engineering differently than Asterians did, because her people built to exact specifications and expected components to perform within designed parameters, but humans built to specifications, and then immediately began testing those limits to see what else was possible. Paul asked if that was a bad thing, and Taven said not bad, just different, because it made human ships unpredictable, which could be advantageous in unexpected situations. And she gestured at the Liberty Runner's engines and said that a properly maintained Asterian vessel would have failed during the race when Paul pushed past safe operating thresholds. But his ship succeeded because she had already been pushed past those thresholds hundreds of times before. She said that Paul had trained his ship to operate beyond her limits, and Paul said he had never thought about it that way. And Taven said he should because it was a valuable perspective. The repairs took 6 weeks, and when they were complete, the Liberty Runner looked much the same from the outside, and still a patchwork of mismatched plating and visible welds, but underneath she was running better than she had in years. And Paul's modifications had been refined and improved and made more efficient without sacrificing their performance advantages. Paul announced to Jake on the day of departure that she was ready and everything was calibrated and tested, and they would not be breaking any speed records for a while, but she would get them where they needed to go. And Jake walked through the ship one final time and said goodbye to the Asterian engineers who had worked on her. When he reached the cargo bay, he found a surprise, and there were crates of supplies and spare parts donated by various alien species who had heard about the Liberty Runner's adventures, and Lisa explained that they were gifts from the merchant station they had helped evacuate, and also from the Calithian Embassy and the Velican Trading Consortium and about a dozen other sources. And apparently they had become popular. Jake asked how popular, and Lisa said they had received 17 contract offers in the last week, and all of them specifically requested the Liberty Runner by name. And Jake shook his head in amazement, because 2 months ago they had been struggling to find work with merchants reluctant to trust their cargo to a ship that looked like it might fall apart at any moment, and now they were turning down offers. The departure from the Asterian yards was attended by more ships than Jake had expected, and Admiral Kistara personally saw them off along with representatives from several other species, and as the Liberty Runner's engines fired up for the first time since the repairs, Paul listened to their hum with satisfaction and reported that everything was smooth as silk and all systems were optimal. Jake ordered Carl to set course for the frontier because they had a cargo contract waiting, and as the Liberty Runner accelerated away from the yards, Carl pulled up a message on his navigation display and said they were receiving a general broadcast from the Galactic News Network, and they were running a story about the Liberty Runner, and Jake told him to put it on screen. A Velican reporter appeared, and her crystalline features were bright with enthusiasm, and she said that the ship known as the Liberty Runner had captured the imagination of the galactic community, and once dismissed as a rust bucket unworthy of notice, this human vessel had proven that determination and ingenuity could overcome technological disadvantages. She continued with footage from the race and interviews with various alien officials, and said that from their brave defense of a civilian station against Krell raiders to their stunning victory in a race against military corvettes, Captain Jake Murphy and his crew had demonstrated that humans were a species to be respected. The report continued, but Jake gestured for Amy to turn it off, and Lisa observed that this was going to follow them around for a while, and Jake said probably, but they should let people talk because they had work to do. The Liberty Runner jumped to hyperspace, and her battered hull disappeared into the void, and behind her, the stories continued to spread about the rust bucket that everyone had laughed at, and the human crew that refused to run when others fled, and the impossible chase that should have ended in destruction, but instead ended in escape, and the race that defied logic and expectations on merchant stations and military vessels, and in diplomatic chambers and trading posts, aliens discussed the Liberty Runner and what she represented, and some saw her as proof that humans belonged in the galactic community, while others saw her as a symbol of the unpredictability that humans brought to established order. But everyone agreed on one thing, and that was nobody would underestimate a human ship again, no matter how worn or patched it appeared. 3 months later, The Liberty Runner was running cargo between frontier colonies when they received an emergency broadcast, and it was another Krell raid, and this time targeting a mining colony with limited defenses, and the nearest military vessels were hours away. Jake looked at his crew, and they looked back at him, and no words were necessary because Lisa plotted a course to the colony, and Paul warmed up the engines without being asked. Amy pointed out that they were not a military vessel, and asked what they could do against Krell raiders, and Jake smiled and said what they did before, and they would make the Krell chase them and buy time until the military arrived, and if they were lucky, they would make the raiders regret ever laughing at this rust bucket. The Liberty Runner changed course and accelerated toward the danger instead of away from it, and on the colony below, desperate people watched their sensor displays and saw a single ship approaching against impossible odds. Then they saw the ship's identification beacon and recognized the name, and the Liberty Runner and the ship that had outrun a Krell pursuit fleet, and the ship that had beaten military corvettes in a race, and the rust bucket that had become a legend hope, began to spread through the colony, because if the Liberty Runner was coming, maybe they had a chance after all. And in the depths of space, an old freighter with mismatched hull plating and modified engines pushed toward maximum speed, and her crew was ready to prove once again that the greatest ships were not always the newest or the prettiest. Sometimes they were just the ones that refused to give up, and Jake sat in his command chair and watched the tactical display fill with red contacts representing the Krell fleet, and he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but also something else, and it was the knowledge that his crew trusted him, and that other ships would follow their example, and that maybe, just maybe, they were changing how the galaxy saw humanity. Lisa reported from her station that they were approaching weapons range and asked if Jake was ready, and he said he was born ready, and told Carl to take them in, and the Liberty Runner raced forward with her engines burning bright, and her crew standing together, and her legend growing with every impossible thing she accomplished. The Krell fleet detected the approaching ship, and their commander studied the tactical display with interest, because this was the human vessel he had heard about, and the one that had escaped his fellow raiders months ago, and he had not believed the stories about its speed. But now he would see for himself. He ordered his ships to intercept and destroy the Liberty Runner because